January 1944. A pale winter sun lifted over the Marshall Islands, throwing long shadows across the coral airstrips carved into the atolls. The morning wind carried a dry, salty breath from the Pacific, sweeping over rows of American aircraft, mute silhouettes waiting for another day of relentless sorties. In the distance, the faint metallic clatter of tools began to echo, a rhythm so fast and precise it sounded almost unnatural to those who were hearing it for the first time. Far offshore, Japanese pilots approaching the islands expected to find American planes grounded, immobilized, and scattered, just as they'd known in their own service, where maintenance crews labored for long stretches to coax worn engines back into the sky. They'd been told that enemy airfields would be disordered, that the Americans lacked the discipline to maintain tempo, that a single strike could halt their operations for hours. But as they descended through the broken cloud cover, they witnessed something that contradicted everything they had been taught. The airstrips below were alive, moving with such velocity and coordination that it seemed less like maintenance and more like a battlefield dance, one in which every man knew his mark and timing with machine-like certainty. It was the sound that struck them first, the recurring symbol of this episode, the metallic clip of the torque wrench, sharp, rhythmic, relentless, snapping out its metallic syllables every few seconds as American ground crews locked panels, tightened bolts, and rearmed fighters at a pace the Japanese pilots had never imagined possible. That sound carried across the airfields like a declaration: order, efficiency, abundance. This moment mattered because the Pacific War was no longer a contest of isolated battles. It had become a race of endurance, industrial weight, and operational tempo. Japan, stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, was already fighting the invisible battle of attrition. Fewer spare parts, fewer engines, fewer skilled mechanics, and far fewer trained pilots than it once had. American air power, on the other hand, was evolving into something entirely unprecedented, a system where logistics and manpower fused into a seamless machine. Records from the Marshall and Gilbert campaigns note remarkable turnaround times. F-4F Wildcats, SBD Dauntlesses, and later F-6F Hellcats were often refueled, rearmed, inspected, and relaunched in under 15 minutes. Some documentation from the U.S. Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force even describes emergency turnarounds of under 10 minutes when multiple waves were required to suppress Japanese defenses. American ground crews worked in teams that had been drilled repeatedly, each crewman responsible for a single narrow task, repeated until it became instinct. Ammunition belts were swapped like clockwork. Fuel lines snapped on and off in fluid motion, and spare parts flowed from ships to runways in quantities the Japanese could scarcely imagine. Japanese pilots, trained in an earlier doctrine where the aircraft itself was a precious and irreplaceable instrument, were stunned by what they saw. Their own aircraft frequently remained grounded for long hours. A Zero often required nearly an hour to prepare for a second sortie, even under ideal conditions. Engines had to be cooled slowly, ammunition loaded by hand, and maintenance performed by small crews lacking specialized tools. Replacement parts were rare. Even basic lubricants had begun to thin by late 1943, forcing crews to ration them. And as the war dragged on, the number of trained mechanics had dwindled, replaced by hastily trained workers who struggled to maintain increasingly worn aircraft. There are fragments of intelligence reports describing Japanese reactions. A captured pilot from the 261st Air Group later told interrogators that he could not comprehend how American aircraft returned to the skies so quickly, remarking that it seemed as if the enemy planes never stopped flying. Another field report from the 4th Marine Air Wing recounts pilots watching Japanese reconnaissance aircraft turn away without engaging, seemingly surprised to find American fighters already airborne again after a previous interception. The emotional contrast deepened when these Japanese airmen realized what the speed symbolized.
It was not merely good training, it was a reflection of the vast industrial engine behind every American pilot. Every torque wrench click, every fresh belt of .50 caliber ammunition, every fuel truck rushing onto the runway was backed by factories thousands of miles away, plants in California, Ohio, and Michigan producing engines faster than Japan could repair them. Each plane that lifted off again within minutes embodied a national philosophy that treated machinery as replaceable, manpower as abundant, and time as a weapon. This revelation altered perceptions deep within the ranks of Japanese aviators. Many had entered the war believing in the superiority of spirit over material. They had been raised on the ideal that determination, discipline, and courage could overcome any industrial deficit. But here, on these airfields, that belief began to fracture. The Americans were using their material power not as a crude hammer, but as a finely tuned instrument. Logistics had become strategy. Efficiency had become a form of dominance. The torque wrench, with its relentless click, became a symbol of this new reality, a reminder that American strength was not merely in numbers, but in the precision with which those numbers were applied. Each click announced another plane ready to rise, another sortie prepared, another blow delivered before the enemy could recover. For Japanese pilots accustomed to long waiting times, to limited fuel reserves, to shortages of ammunition so severe that some training flights were conducted without live rounds, this was more than a tactical difference. It was ideological. Transformation came gradually. Intelligence officers reported declining morale among Japanese pilots after witnessing American turnaround speeds. Some airmen later reflected that they no longer believed victory was possible once they understood the scale and speed of the enemy's operations. The war was no longer shaped by battles they could win through skill. It was shaped by a system that replaced losses faster than Japan could tally them. As the conflict moved deeper into the Central Pacific, through the Marshalls, the Marianas, and toward the Philippines, this pattern only intensified. American carriers operated with such rapid cycling of aircraft that Japanese commanders often misjudged how many planes were actually on deck. They believed they were facing multiple squadrons, when in fact it was the same aircraft returning again and again, refreshed with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts in an unending cadence of warfare. And always, beneath the roar of engines and the heat of the Pacific sun, the torque wrench clicked on. In the end, when historians look back at the Pacific War, they often point to great battles: Midway, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. But beneath those battles were the quiet victories won on the ground by the men who turned aircraft in minutes. Their speed reshaped the tempo of the war, overwhelmed an adversary built on older assumptions, and demonstrated that abundance, when organized with discipline, becomes an unassailable strategic force. The war would end, but the symbol remained, the rhythmic click of the torque wrench, echoing across the coral dust, a sound that captured the essence of American strength: resourceful, relentless, democratic in the division of labor. A sound that reminded the world that freedom, when supported by unity and industry, could rise again and again, as tirelessly as the planes that returned to the sky. And in that enduring rhythm, one finds a larger truth: that the power of a free nation is not only in the battles it fights, but in the hands of ordinary men who keep its engines turning.